We're still in the prelude to chapter 6. We're just getting ready to start it, but just as a little bit of a review, since we missed last week, we took a brief
Question?
Okay, we're answering the 4 questions that the disciples had asked Jesus in what's known as the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24 and Luke 21. When you put those passages together, there was 3, really almost 4 questions. And interesting, Jesus didn't answer them in the same order that they asked them. They identified the 3 questions, really 4. When will the temple be destroyed, and what signs will point to its destruction? What are the signs of Christ coming into his kingdom? What will be signs at the end of the age of the Gentiles that is coming to an end? And then Jesus answered the question they didn't ask, is what are not signs? And so we've answered those, and we're actually on the last one. When will these things, i.e. the destruction of the temple structure, take place, and what will be the signs of these things? And both Matthew and Luke record this question coming from the disciples, but only Luke took time to give us Jesus' full answer here. And if you compare some of these passages, in both Gospels, we found the answer to the question. Matthew ends with a comment on birth pangs, while Luke adds that there will be great signs from heaven. And then the narratives in each Gospel diverge very subtly but meaningfully. In Matthew, the narration continues forward with the connecting word then. Clearly, the events that follow next in Matthew's account follow the events Jesus just explained. So Jesus had just explained the signs that the end of the age was approaching. So what comes next in Matthew's account must be near the end of that age. In Luke's Gospel, the connecting words are different. Luke records Jesus saying, "But before all these things," and that's in direct opposite direction from Matthew. So Luke is recording an explanation that precedes the end of the age. In fact, if you jump down to Matthew 24:29 and then compare it to Luke 21:25, you see the difference. Okay, so then both accounts merge again at that point. But in the verses in between, each author chooses to record different aspects of Jesus' words. And Jesus' entire testimony is found by combining both accounts along with Mark. But we need to follow the internal signpost to be sure we assemble them in a proper way. So let's look at how Jesus answers that question as recorded in Luke. And there will be signs in the sun and the moons and the stars on the earth, distress of nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the seas. So once again, the accounts merge at this point. And then we looked at Luke 21:12, how he answered the question according to Luke. In some ways, this part of the Olivet Discourse is of kind of minimal importance to our study because it relates to events that have already taken place. But as it does turn out, it is kind of relevant because it clears up a lot of common misinterpretations of end-time events. In this passage, Jesus gives the disciples a personal warning about what they would face in the years leading up to the temple destruction. He says that before all the things of the end times, the disciples will be the victims of persecution. They will be delivered to synagogues, prisons, and before kings and governors. And we know that Jesus was speaking to the disciples who walked with him, since they were the ones sitting on the Mount of Olives that evening hearing these words. And more importantly, they were the men who suffered the very things described in this description. They were persecuted by the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities. And no generation of Christians since AD 70 has been dragged into synagogues. They're not universal statements to all Christians. These are statements to a certain group of men, specifically the apostles at a particular point in time. Because every generation of Christians has experienced persecution in some ways, and including some of the ways here, but that doesn't mean all of these words were a promise to all Christians. For example, not all Christians will be betrayed by parents. Not all Christians are dragged before kings. Not all Christians are put to death for their faith. But these disciples saw those things. To the disciples, Jesus gave an assurance. He said that though they were hated, not a hair of their head would perish. By their endurance they will gain their lives. And those statements really kind of seem kind of confusing at first, since since they died. And some students have wondered if Jesus was proposing a salvation dependent on their perseverance, but he was really just using a euphemism there. The word perish means to come to an end, and the word for lives is the word for soul or heart. So he was using what's known as hyperbole to emphasize that nothing in this world can bring them to an end. They would receive blessing in their eternal lives for their endurance. Okay, the specific circumstances when the temple was destroyed, we see here in this passage, the first sign would be the city surrounded by armies. That occurred in AD 66. Then the Roman general Gallus was sent to put down a Jewish rebellion, and he camped outside the city and sieged it. But then Jesus said this is a sign to flee the city, and others should not enter the city. But how can they expect to leave if the city is surrounded? Isn't it a little too late by then? But actually what happened is the Roman general had to retreat to defend the supply lines from Jewish attack. So while he was battling that, he died, and his replacement didn't come for 2 years, until AD 68. So that pause in the siege gave people the opportunity to escape the city and go to the mountains. Now the only ones who left were the ones who believed Jesus' word, because the ones who stayed, once Titus came and surrounded the city, they estimate up to 1.1 million Jews were killed in Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. And that's recorded by, if you've heard the Jewish historian Josephus, recorded the events that happened, because he was an eyewitness, and he claimed that up to 1.1 million Jews were killed and the temple was burned to the ground, and the city was utterly laid waste. And in fact, the Roman general celebrated the victory by commissioning an arch in Rome, and it still stands there today. A lot of times after a big campaign, the Roman generals would come back to Rome, and they would build these big arches with all kind of things engraved, memorializing what they had done. And that one stands in Rome to today, and here's part of it. You know what he's talking about, AD 70, because there's that big menorah candle off to the side, so it really couldn't have been anything else other than the siege of Jerusalem. And this is where we left off. So we're going to look at Jesus' answer to the final question, will be the sign of your coming, and then finally get back to Revelation chapter 6. So we're just about there. Luke 21:20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are inside the city depart from it. Oh, I already did this slide. Okay. Then they will, Matthew 24. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So this passage moves forward from the signs of the end of the age, not backward like Luke does. But notice how similar the words are to Luke chapter 21. Luke recorded Jesus telling the disciples they would face persecution and betrayal and death and hatred and martyrdom. They must endure, and they will gain their lives. Here in Matthew, he has very similar words, and these similarities are really the cause of a lot of confusion and a lot of confused interpretations. A quick glance at the text leaves us assuming really the two authors were describing the same events, but they weren't. A more careful examination reveals that Luke was recording the description of the times before the temple was destroyed. Matthew is recording a description of the times of the tribulation, and there's several clues in the text that tell us that. The first one, we already noted the difference in the way the two passages were introduced, the wording that was used. Secondly, Matthew's account includes several details that do not match the time immediately before the temple was destroyed. First, he says many false prophets will arise to mislead many. That's not an accurate description of the early church period. There was false teachers, but they did not mislead many. In a similar fashion, lawlessness did on increase, and people's love did not grow cold during the early church age. In fact, quite the opposite. The church grew, and it led to fellowship and love among the saints, according to Paul's letters. And finally, he said, many will fall away. This is the exact opposite of what happened in the early church. The church saw not a falling away, but rather explosive growth between the years in the 30s and by the time the temple fell. So while this description sounds similar to the one in Luke, it's not equal sameness. The sound Simply because they both the early church and the time of tribulation include persecution of saints. And persecution always looks the same. People hating people, betraying each other, and the need for endurance. But the rest of the details tell us that Matthew and Luke diverged in their accounts, and they were actually talking about different things. Now Matthew's account transitions to signs that will occur during the tribulation. And these details will become important in our study as we get back to Revelation chapter 6. So then Matthew continues, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the ones who are on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." Matthew's account transitions to signs that occurred during the tribulation. These details, like I said, become important to our study as we get into chapter 6. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on those verses right there, since a lot of this material and these things are actually going to be covered. But there's some key things to notice. Jesus mentions that there will be an abomination of desolation that Daniel mentions, and that is described in Daniel chapter 9:27. "And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate." This is in Daniel 9:27, and it occurs in the middle of the last seven, or 3.5 years into the tribulation, or about halfway through it. We don't know what that abomination is yet, but we've learned that when we get to later in the tribulation. Whatever it was, it becomes a marker for the midpoint. We know this is halfway through. And Jesus said that it's a defining moment for believers in the tribulation, and any who are here. Like the believer in Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem, the believer in tribulation needs to recognize this event and act accordingly. As with the earlier warnings, believers should heed Jesus' warning and get out of Jerusalem. While the earlier warning was to avoid the destruction of the city at the hands of the Romans, this warning is to avoid something even more sinister and powerful. In verse 21 of this, Jesus says this coming disaster will be a tribulation unlike anything that has ever occurred since the beginning of the world, nor ever will be. This is not merely the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. This is something completely and altogether different. But once again, you can see how you can confuse sometimes the time periods here between what Luke is describing and what Matthew is describing. The rest of this discourse in here we're going to get more into as we get back into Revelation. So then we look at both the way both Matthew and Luke describe the Lord's return, or at least Matthew does. Excuse me. Matthew 24:27. "For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." Through most of this, though most of this is going to wait for future weeks, we're just kind of summarize what he's saying right here. In the last years before Christ's return, the world will be filled with supernatural wonders that no one can ignore, and we're going to study them as we go back into Revelation chapter 6 through 19. And the return of Christ itself is an event that no one is going to miss at all. For as the lightning comes from the east and the west, all the natural sources of light will cease. That's what this is implying here. The only light will be from Christ himself as he returns, and he will gather those on earth who are his and come to them. Matthew gives us a parable of the fig tree blooming after winter to picture the soon fulfillment of Jesus' return. So once believers see the world experiencing these events, they should expect the Lord very, very soon, within 3.5 years, according to Daniel. So, in fact, once the tribulation begins and the abomination occurs, the time for Christ's second coming can be timed exactly. Because you know it's 7 years long, and the abomination of desolation is going to occur halfway through it. So you know exactly when he's coming back. His return 7 years from the covenant and 3.5 years from the abomination. But what about the passage that follows that? But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them away. So it will be with the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. He's describing here his return for the church. Until now he was giving signs of his coming into his kingdom. But what are we believers supposed to watch for? Based on this context, he's turning to a description for the church. So what are we supposed to be watching for as believers in the time period that we're in right now? The rapture. Of course, the disciples didn't understand this. They were focused on the arrival of the kingdom. So Jesus concludes his answer by focusing on the signs that believers should be most watchful for. Jesus begins by saying that day and hour no one knows, not even the Son. That can't be a reference to a second coming, because you know it's going to be 7 years after the peace treaty and 3.5 years after the abomination. The date will be known by every believer once the covenant is signed and the last of the 7 begins. And that prophecy has been in place in Daniel's book. So this hour must be an hour that only the Father determines. And that brings us back to the Jewish wedding ceremony, where the Father determines the hour and day for the Son to return to claim his bride. So what follows is a description of Jesus' return for the church, or the rapture, which we're going to be studying a little bit next week. Jesus compares the rapture to the entrance of Noah's family into the ark, which you remember occurred 7 days before the waters fell. Interestingly enough, Noah and his family and the animals were put in the ark, and then the Lord closed the door, and nothing happened for 7 days. Likewise, the church, we're going to enter our ark, that is Christ, 7 years before that final judgment comes upon the earth. And I'm talking about the end of the tribulation period. And that moves Jesus to remind the church that the Lord's return will happen when you don't expect it, and we must always be ready. We'll be engaged in our regular lives when Christ will suddenly interrupt it. Okay, we're going to move next to the tribulation itself and get into chapter 6, and we're going to look at some different ways to study it. Next week, we're going to take a break, 1 week break from Revelation, because remember in the spring we looked at the the spring feast. We're going to look at the fall feasts. In particular, the Feast of Trumpets, which actually occurs on Sunday, September the 13th. And we're going to examine some of those things that we just said there in light of that. Okay. We're finally through with the introduction to tribulation, to chapters 6 through 19. So now we can look at the opening events of this amazing period of history, the breaking of the seals, which we're going to get to in a minute. So we progressed through the first 3 chapters, looking at the letters to the churches. Then we studied 4 and 5 to learn that the church age had ended and the church has been removed from the earth. And then between chapters 4 and 5, we took time. We're going to study the rapture, and we looked at a lot of those Old Testament and things from the Gospels and the Epistles to make sense of what we're going to be looking at, and answered those questions. Why is there a tribulation? Who is it intended for? When is it going to start? How long is it going to last? All those kind of questions. Because once you've laid that foundation, then you can understand better what's going to be happening starting in chapter 6 through 19. So, following the rapture, following 4 and 5, Jesus is going to start to begin here in chapter 6, exercising his authority to judge. So, as he begins to open the deed, and he opens it one seal at a time, and his actions in heaven are going to begin to trigger responses on earth, and that is what we call the tribulation. As these judgments unfold, it's rather complex, and it's intertwined and sometimes often overlapping series of events. Sometimes the events are supernatural, so that everybody recognizes them. Other times the events appear entirely natural, so that the world is unaware that the Lord is exercising his authority. So our current phase is going to cover chapter 6 through 9, and the period begins with the covenant described by Daniel and takes us through the first half of the tribulation. And it's going to lead us to the next phase, which is the midpoint of the tribulation, defined by the abomination of desolation, which is also described in Daniel. The midpoint is itself a complex and overlapping series of events, once again clustered around that 3.5-year point. And then later we're going to move on to the last phase, looking at the second half of the tribulation, followed still by more phases that examine the events. And as you see from there, it actually jumps around a little bit. The first part of the tribulation is 6 through 9, but then chapter 17 also talks about the first half. 10 through 14 talks about the middle, and then 15 through 18 talks about the second half, and then Christ's return in verses 19 and 20. So what do we know? We studied numerous signs and warnings that will alert us to the approaching end of the age. Some events were prerequisites to tribulation. Tribulation could not take place until these events had transpired. Events like persecution of the apostles, the temple destruction, Israel's scattering, the regathering of Israel, apostasy in the church, famines, earthquakes, world wars, we looked at all of that. All of these preceding signs have already happened or are happening now. The Bible gives us other signs that tribulation itself was underway. Some signs will happen early in the tribulation. The signing of a covenant, the man of lawlessness being revealed, signs and wonders in the sky, and martyrdom for the saints. Then Daniel tells us that the abomination of desolation will mark the midpoint, once again, of the tribulation. And then in the second half, we're going to see unprecedented distress, the Jews fleeing Jerusalem, the false prophets deceiving many, and finally Christ's return. And then from here, now that we've seen all this and kind of laid out almost like an outline of what we're going to be looking at, we're going to turn to the opening of the first 4 seals in chapter 6. Yay, we're in chapter 6, finally. I'll just go ahead and read it. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a loud voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. Then he opened the third seal, and I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures, saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the field. Interesting, John begins this with the word now, which in some translations meaning is then, meaning this is the next thing that he saw. This is the next thing that happened. And remember the scene that we left in chapter 5 a few weeks ago. Jesus is in the throne room holding the land deed. It's got the 7 seals, and he's cracking open those seals one at a time. As he breaks the first seal, one of the 4 creatures says to John, "Come." The meaning in this context is to look away from his immediate surroundings and gaze down upon the earth, because that's where these things are going to be happening, on the earth. And that begins a common pattern in the book of Revelation. From here on, John is witness to events in heaven, He has been transported there in a vision, so he describes what he sees. But the events that are going to be happening here are going to be on the earth. And so they're telling him, come to look at the effect. So in response to the command, John says he looked, meaning upon the earth, and he saw a white horse. And that's where we'll pick up next time. We're going to look at the 4 horses and who the riders are. Maybe take a guess at who that could be. Maybe a little bit. I've got a couple minutes. Each of the first 4 seals results in the appearance of another horse. Each horse has a different color. So there's no doubt that John saw horses as he wrote, but it's also apparent from the descriptions where we're going to look at that these 4 horses were also symbolic. The variation in color and the description of what they carry tells us they are symbols that to communicate what is actually happening on the earth. So the first one, the first horse, let's look at him. The first horse is white, and it carries an unnamed rider. The rider arrives with a bow, but what's curious about that? He has no arrows. It's like a gun with no bullets. So when someone waves a gun at you, you're still kind of intimidated, right? So he's waving this bow. It's suggesting a man carrying a bow suggests someone who brings the threat of attack, but at this point he's lacking the capacity to carry it out. He also has a crown. The Greek word used to describe crown there is called Stephanos, and it was a crown that you earned through recognition of your achievements. Like at the ancient Greek games, you ever saw they would put that wreath on their head? That was a Stephanos. It just means that you had accomplished something. That's a different Greek word than the one meaning a royal crown, which is diadem. And it says that this rider goes out conquering and to conquer. What does that mean? Going out implies that he's going out into the world. And conquering to conquer implies that he begins to take control, but the process occurs over time. It's nothing that he just steps into right away. He's conquering and to conquer. He doesn't finish his conquest in a moment, but he progresses toward that goal over a period of time. All these details work in harmony to reveal what's happening on the earth when the first seal is broken. The horse is white because white horses were traditionally reserved for royalty or somebody in power and authority. It was a symbol of a very powerful leader. And the man's crown here is a Stephanos rather than a diadem. The man is earning his authority over a period of time through conquest. Finally, we know the tribulation begins with the signing of an agreement brokered by a very powerful world leader. So let's just jump back, just for a second, back to Daniel. Daniel 9:26. And after the 62 weeks an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. There is a prince who is to come, and he will make it a covenant. The breaking of the first seal results in his revealing. So what else can we learn from Scripture about this man who launches the world into tribulation and who was associated with this first horse? He is the prince to come, and he's going to make a covenant. The arrival of a prince with the power to broker such a deal makes possible such a covenant. He originates from the people who destroy the temple and the city, that is the Romans. And since the Roman Empire dissolved, we're not really going to be able to identify the people of this coming ruler, except to say maybe that he's a Gentile and is very likely either European or Middle Eastern, because the Roman Empire covered vast territories. So the breaking of the first seal results in the revealing of this leader. What else can we learn from Scripture about this man who launches the world into tribulation? The Bible gives this coming world leader a variety of names. Would you reach over and hit that, April? Light. In Genesis 3, he's called the seed of Satan. In Daniel 7, he's the little horn. In Daniel 9, he is the prince that is to come. In 2 Thessalonians, he's the man of sin. He's also described as the son of perdition. and also the lawless one. In Revelation, he's the beast, and John calls him the Antichrist. And that's the title that we all know best, the one that the Apostle John gives us in all of his letters, the Antichrist or Antichristos, which means one who opposes Christ. And in light of how many different ways the Bible describes this character, we need to take some time to understand who he is, because he's a major player. Even John himself uses the term Antichrist at least in a couple different ways. And we will go into that next week. Now we can finish.